The Path is a teaching series sponsored by World Missionary Evangelism. We hope that this series will deepen your knowledge and walk in our Lord Jesus Christ. Here's your host, John Cathcart.
Well, we continue with our study of the life of Paul. Now, it's interesting, but besides a few scattered remnants of church tradition, we only have two sources to derive the history of Paul's life, and those are the Acts of the Apostles, written by Luke, and the epistles written by Paul himself. Now, the Acts of the Apostles is a genuine and trustworthy history, but Acts and the epistles are admittedly fragmentary because neither of them professes to give us any narrative, continuous narrative, of the apostles' life. You know, I know that in my own case as the leader of World Missionary Evangelism, I wish somebody had documented the life and work of Dr. Johnny Douglas. Occasionally I get a request from a Bible school. Can you send us a book on his life? No, I can't. And I wish someone had documented especially the last 10 years when he was pioneering the work in India. Now, I've been amused at how many Indian nationals have told me that the work of World Missionary Evangelism began with Dr. Douglas and their personal father. And obviously, it could not have started with everyone's father. But the problem is that we don't expect, with men like Paul and Dr. Douglas, we don't expect the extensive results that can follow. And by the time it becomes apparent that something big and notable has happened or is happening, it's too late to document it. And if it had not been for the fact that a man called Bartleman took it on himself to document what happened at Azusa Street with Pentecost, we would know nothing about, or virtually nothing about, the early days of Pentecost in the United States. Strange thing is, the life of Paul, getting back to Paul, is only known to us at intervals during its middle and later period, which is between the years 36 to 66 AD. So we can say that Paul's life is like a book of which the beginning and the end have been lost. But our knowledge is very limited, even of the part of his life that we do know something about. Now, the most interesting proof of this is the passage in Paul's epistles, which is often referred to as, quote, the Iliad of woes, in the second epistle to the Corinthians, were driven against his will by the accusations and put-downs of his enemies to an appearance of boastfulness which was abhorrent to him. Paul was forced to write a summary sketch of what he had done and suffered. And that list is given long before the end of his career. And yet of the specific outrages and dangers that Paul mentions, he mentions no less than 11 that simply are not mentioned once in the book of Acts. And there were others which were subsequent to that sad list that Paul put together. Now, not one of the 5 scourgings with Jewish thongs is mentioned by Luke. Only one of the 3 beatings with Roman rods. Not one of the 3 shipwrecks, although a later one is elaborately detailed. There's no allusion in Acts of the night and the day on the deep. And we only hear about 2 of what St. Clement tells us were 7 imprisonments. And there are even whole classes of perils to which the writer of the Acts makes no allusions at all, even though he was at one time a companion of Paul. For example, what is Paul talking about when he talks about the perils of rivers, the perils of robbers, the perils in the wilderness, the perils among false brethren, the hunger, the thirst, the fasting, the cold and nakedness? And these which are passed over without notice in the book of Acts are only mentioned so cursorily in the epistles. So generally and so unchronologically that scarcely one of them can be dwelt on and assigned with due certainty to its due order in Paul's biography. And if this is the case, who can pretend that in such a life there is not room for a series of events and actions in the narrative which neither did or could find a place in the letters, and for events and features of characters in the letters which had no reflection in the narrative? And of those letters of Paul, how many preserved? 13 only, out of a much larger number which he must undoubtedly have written. And of these 13 that we have, some are separated from the others by great intervals of time. Some scarcely contain a single particular which can be made to bear on a consecutive biography. And not one is preserved which gives us the earliest stage of his views and experiences before he set foot on European soil. However, and on the other hand, we have enough information and more than enough to show us what manner of life Paul lived and what kind of man Paul was. And it is a fact that a biography sketched in outline is often more true and useful than one which occupies itself with minute detail. We do not know more of a great man because we happen to know the petty circumstances which made up his daily existence, or because of a mistaken admiration handed down to posterity that presents the promiscuous commonplaces of his ordinary correspondence. We know a man truly when we know him at his greatest and his best. We realize his significance for ourselves and for the world when we see him in the noblest activity of his career, on the loftiest summit, and in the fullest glory of his life.
Just as it is in America, the key to escaping poverty is education. World Missionary Evangelism has long recognized the importance of education and has emphasized it to the children that we save via our child sponsorship programs and Food for Hunger programs. We have established schools, and these schools provide the basic education these children need to begin to escape the poverty that has ensnared their families, often for generations. What can you do to help us educate children? In many cases, we need new schools. World Missionary Evangelism also needs books and supplies. Children have to have school uniforms in many nations just to attend schools. And of course, there's the need for things like backpacks. How can you get involved? Find out the various costs of providing a child with things like school supplies, backpacks, a desk, a school uniform, or perhaps even an education at a university or college. An education builds a bridge between hopelessness and hope. It provides a future where dreams can be realized. It also positions a child to become a leader as an adult, and in that leadership role, lift his family and his country out of the bonds of poverty. You can begin right now by supporting programs at World Missionary Evangelism that emphasize education.
In the last segment, we were talking about how little we really know about the life of Paul. Basically, we have an outline. But nothing can obscure for us Paul as he stands in the light of history. Paul is presented to us in the record of Christianity. Paul as energetic as Peter, Paul as contemplative as John, Paul the hero of unselfishness, Paul the mighty champion of spiritual freedom. Paul is a greater preacher than Chrysostom. Paul is a greater missionary than Xavier. Paul a greater reformer than Luther. Paul a greater theologian than St. Thomas Aquinas. Paul, the inspired apostle of the Gentiles. Paul, the slave of the Lord Jesus Christ. Now, we can't state with perfect accuracy the date of either the birth or the death of the great apostle, but both can be inferred within narrow limits. When Paul is first mentioned in connection with the stoning of Stephen, he's called a young man. When he wrote his epistle to Philemon, Paul calls himself Paul the Aged. And the limits of age and youth were as indeterminate in ancient time as they are today. But since Paul was entrusted with a most important mission immediately after the death of Stephen, and was in all probability a member of the Sanhedrin, he must, at that time, that's the martyrdom of Stephen, been about 30 years of age. And the martyrdom of Stephen probably took place in 37 AD, and the epistle to Philemon was written about 63 AD. And at that time, the latter time, he must have been less than 60 years of age, and may seem to be a bit too young to claim the title of aged. But age is a very relative term. And if you have been scourged, lashed, stoned, imprisoned, shipwrecked, and if you had been someone who for many years, besides the heavy burden of mental anguish and responsibility, had been scorched by the heat of the sun and tossed by the violence of the waves, you could well feel yourself to be old and worn out, especially when you're writing from your Roman prison at the age of 60. It's therefore tolerably certain that he was born during the first 10 years of our era, and probably that he was born about, say, 3 AD. Thus, the birth of Christ's greatest follower happened in the same decade as that of our Lord himself. But all the circumstances which surrounded the cradle and infancy of the infant Paul were widely different from those amid which his Lord had grown to boyhood. Jesus grew to boyhood in an obscure and lonely village of Palestine, in the middle of surroundings that were almost exclusively Judaic. And it was there that Jesus, as the scripture says, grew in stature and favor with God and man. But Paul, on the other hand, passed his earliest years in the famous capital of a Roman province, and must have recalled with his last conscious reminiscences the language and the customs of the pagan world. Well, there is no sufficient reason to doubt the entire accuracy of Paul's expression, quote, born in Tarsus, which is attributed to Paul in his Hebrew speech to the infuriated multitude from the steps of the Tower of Antonia. Well, to say, as some do, that the speeches in the book of Acts could not have attained to verbal exactness could be true of some of them, that is, as they're recorded. But on the other hand, on this occasion, it would have been far more to the purpose of Luke if he'd made Paul say he was born in a Jewish town. So we therefore reject a curious and 3 times asserted statement of St. Jerome that Paul was born in Palestine in Giscala and had been taken to Tarsus by his parents when they left their native city in consequence of its devastation by the Romans. On the other hand, we can assume that the parents or grandparents of Paul had been Galileans and for some cause or another had been compelled to migrate from Giscala to the busy capital of pagan Cilicia. Now, it's interesting to me to note that if you leave Caesarea, which is about 50 miles northwest of Jerusalem, on the Mediterranean coast of the Holy Land, and you sail due north for about 300 miles, you come to Tarsus in ancient Cilicia. And in no time as you make this journey are you more than 60 miles off the coast. And it's easy to see how Paul's father or grandfather could have gone there. Now, Cilicia was a district of Asia Minor and is part of what we now call Turkey. It adjoined Syria on the west and was south of Galatia and east of Pamphylia. And the northern limit of Cilicia was the crest of Mount Taurus, while the Taurus Mountains themselves were a rugged mountain chain, ran along an east-west line, which separated Anatolia, which may have been the site of the Garden of Eden, from areas that lay to the south. Well, Cilicia was divided into what is called Cilicia Trachea and Cilicia Pedius. And Tarsus was located in Cilicia Trachea. Cilicia itself was shaped like a fat oval, big fat oval. And it probably helps us to think of Cilicia as being somewhat like the United States, with Taurus being where Dallas is, roughly in the middle. Now, Cilicia Trachea was a rugged mountain district formed by the spurs of the Taurus Mountains. They often terminated in rocky headlands with small sheltered harbors on the northern shores of the Mediterranean Sea, and were an ideal resort for pirates. So Cilicia Trachea was kind of a wild place, and Tarsus was a pagan city.
60 years ago, world missionary evangelism began when John E. Douglas Sr. accepted the challenge of caring for 6 orphan children in India. From this act of love sprang a work that has grown to include children's homes, schools, leper clinics, vocational and agricultural education, disaster relief, feeding programs, drilling water wells, and building churches. And at the heart of all of WME's work has been living out the Great Commission to take the news of salvation through Jesus to everyone we meet. During these 6 decades, World Missionary Evangelism's work has grown from the initial effort to save 6 children in India to establishing mission projects across the globe. To celebrate 60 years of Christian outreach, World Missionary Evangelism has developed our 60 for 60 program. The 60 for 60 campaign is a way for you to help us commemorate 6 decades of work and fund programs for the future. By giving $60 a month to our 60 for 60 campaign, you can help us expand our outreach. To begin your support of the 60 for 60 campaign today, mail in your gift. Send it to WME, Post Office Box 660-800. That's 660-800. Dallas, Texas 75266.
Well, although Paul was a Tarsian, because he was from Tarsus, on every possible occasion he assumes and glories in the title of an Israelite and also of a Hebrew. Call himself a Hebrew of the Hebrews. Now, in its proper and technical sense, the word Hebrew is a direct opposite of a Hellenist or a Greek, to use a more familiar and modern term. Now, Paul, if brought up in Tarsus, could only be regarded as a Jew of the diaspora or the Jewish dispersion. He was a Jew of that vast body who, even when they were not ignorant of Hebrew, as even the most learned of them sometimes were, still spoke Greek as their native tongue. And it may be said that Paul only uses the word Hebrew in its general sense, and when he does so, that he meant to imply he was not a Hellenist to the same extent that even so learned an eminent Jew as Philo was, who, with all his great ability, did not know either biblical Hebrew or Aramaic. Perhaps Paul spoke Aramaic with equal or greater fluency than he spoke Greek itself. And his knowledge of Hebrew may be inferred from his custom of sometimes reverting to the Hebrew scriptures in the original, when the Septuagint in Greek is less suitable to his purpose. And it's an interesting, though undesigned, confirmation of this fact that the divine vision, when Paul was on the road to Damascus, spoke to him at the supreme moment of his life in the language that was evidently the language of his inmost thoughts. Language controls how you think. And as one, therefore, to whom the Hebrew of that day was a sort of mother tongue, and the Hebrew of the Bible an acquired language, Paul might call himself a Hebrew, though technically speaking, he was also a Hellenist. And so the term would be still more precise and cogent if his parents and forefathers had, almost at the time of his birth, been Palestinian Jews. Well, the Tarsus in which Paul was born was very different from the dirty, ruinous, squalid Muslim city which still bore its name in the 1900s and stands on the same site. The features of the city remain unchanged. Fertile plain still surround it. Snowy mountains, the chain of Taurus, still look down on it. The bright stream of the Cydnus River still refreshes it, although no longer flows through it. But with these scenes of beauty and majesty we're not concerned, because they seem to have had no influence over the mind of the youthful Paul. Now, we can easily imagine how, in a differently constituted nature, they would have been a continued inspiration and would have melted into the very imagery of his thoughts, and how in the crowded cities and foul prisons they would have flashed upon that inward eye which is the bliss of solitude. It's interesting that the scenes in which the whole life of David had been spent were far less majestic, as well as less varied than many of those in which the life of Paul was cast. Yet the Psalms of David are the very handbook of poetic description, while the epistles of Paul only breathe the air of cities and synagogues. Paul alludes indeed to the temple not made with hands, but never to its pillars, and only once to its mighty stars. To David, the wide universe was but one vast house of God, in which the angel ministrants, fire and hail, snow and vapor, wind and storm, fulfill his word. Now with Paul, though he's well aware of the invisible things of him from the creation of the world that are clearly visible, being apprehended by things which he had made, even his eternal power and Godhead, Paul was aware of that. Yet to Paul, this was an indisputable axiom, not a conviction, constantly renewed with admiration and delight. Now, there are few writers who, to judge solely from their writings, seem to have been less moved by the beauties of the external world than Paul was. And though Paul sailed again and again across the blue Mediterranean and must have been familiar with the beauty of those isles of Greece, and though he had again and again traversed the pine-clad gorges of the Asian hills and had seen Mount Ida and Olympus and Parnassus in all their majesty, and though his life had been endangered in mountain torrents and stormy waves, and he certainly must have often wandered as a child along the banks of his native stream, to see the place where it roars its cataracts over a rocky course. Paul's soul was so absorbed in the mighty moral and spiritual truths, which was his great mission to proclaim, that not by one verse, scarcely even by a single expression, in all his letters does he indicate the faintest gleam or delight or wonder in the glories of nature. Now, there is indeed an exquisite passage in his speech at Lystra on the goodness of the living God which made heaven and earth and the sea and all things that are therein, and, quote, let not himself without witness in that he did good and gave rain from heaven and fruitful seasons, filling our hearts with food and gladness. However, there are those who believe that this sermon may have been crafted by Barnabas and reflect him much more than Paul. In my own opinion, a lot of preparation went into this, because today we fail to realize how momentous this occasion was, what a watershed event it was when the things of God were first taken and preached to the Gentiles.
World Missionary Evangelism's missions often extend beyond normal methods of Christian outreach. For generations, we have built farms and taught the skills needed to sow and reap. With operations ranging from crop farming to livestock, poultry, and even fish production, WME adapts our agricultural outreach to meet the strengths of the area and the needs of its people. For decades, World Missionary Evangelism farm missions have provided not only a business income for the poor, but the food produced on those farms is often used in our feeding programs and by our children's homes. The importance of this ministry and what it produces cannot be overstated, as it opens the door for us to share the gospel. Thus, even in farming, the evangelism in World Missionary Evangelism is not just a part of the name. It defines our mission, our focus, and is the heart of our work.